Hidden below. Milo couldn't figure out what kind of place this was that they had stumbled into. There were no walls besides the outer ones, and no decoration of any kind. There were no tables, no chairs, and nothing that said anything about the building's use. But in the back corner was a door that led to some stairs. They debated if it would be worth going down and checking the basement out. Alice was strictly against it. But when Milo pointed out that they would be forced to either stay in the building forever or face the machine guns outside, so they agreed to make Dexter go down and inspect the area. He went begrudgingly and slowly stumbled downwards. He took a flashlight with him and stepped into the darkness. After a few seconds, Milo became worried, but Dex poked his head back around the corner and smiled. "You aren't going to believe this," he said, as he motioned for them to follow him into the unknown. "It's some kind of tunnel or something. It follows the road, too, so we can keep moving in the right direction." He seemed as proud as if he had just created the tunnel himself, specifically for their journey. Milo walked down the stairs and peered around. Indeed, the tunnel followed the road and had been carved straight out of the earth. It was short and somewhat narrower than Milo found comfortable, but it was their only option, and he couldn't spit in the face of good fortune. He handed another flashlight to Alice and pulled one out for himself. "Where do you think it'll lead us?" asked Alice in a doubtful voice. "That way," said Dexter jokingly as he pointed his flashlight down a long, misty path. She pursed her lips and tilted her head out, but took off walking into the darkness without them. Dexter turned to Milo. "There's something about her I don't like, Milo." No sense of humor. Milo gave his friend an expressionless face in return, but something about Dex's eyes and the way they seemed to be plotting made Milo think that Dexter may have suspected what Milo was feeling towards Alice. It made Milo uncomfortable, and he lurched past him into the tunnel to avoid any further discussion. "It stinks in here," said Dexter after a long bout of silence. "I thought that was you," retorted Alice. Milo giggled and received a sharp glance from Dex. "Careful, you forget which one of us has a gun," Dex said as he waved his rifle around in a circle. But Alice suddenly drew out a pistol from her coat pocket and aimed it directly at Dexter's forehead. He stopped dead in his tracks, and his eyes went crossed as he followed the line of the barrel. "You forget that you aren't supposed to trust me," she said with a devilish smile as she put the gun back in her pocket. It took Dexter and Milo by such surprise that the trio walked in a sort of mortified silence. Milo knew the event would come back to haunt him when he finally got to speak to Dex in private again, but he tried to put it out of his mind for the time being. The claustrophobic nature of the tunnel was starting to get to him, and his heart was beginning to race. He kept wishing that the light of their lamps would shine just a little bit further into the distance, and he was starting to hear noises creeping up behind them. One sounded so much like a footstep that they all twirled around and shone their lights back down the path. For a split second, Milo swore he could see the same shadowy man that he had seen in the fog above, now standing in the tunnel with them, but it vanished just as quickly. Neither of the others claimed to have seen anything, but there was a newfound uneasiness among them, and their pace seemed to quicken with every step. The endless dark went on for ages and began to make them agitated, as if something was pulling emotions into their minds that wouldn't have usually been there. They began arguing with each other over nothing at all. "You're not holding your flashlight out far enough," shouted Dexter at Alice as she swatted at his face with an open palm. Milo pushed past them and began pulling far ahead. He walked until they were no longer in sight behind him. Slowly his head began to feel uneasy, and he became dizzy. The air was thick to breathe, as if it had been poisoned, and he found himself on his knees, clutching at his throat until the veil lifted. As if a curtain had simply been pulled back, he opened his eyes to find himself in an open space outside of the tunnel. It was another basement. There were boxes scattered about that had been soaked by a leak in the plumbing that also left the ground covered in nearly an inch of water. Milo stood up and he dried his hands on his pants. Dex and Alice finally came stumbling into the room and fell at his feet. "Make it stop!" screamed Alice in a shrill voice that tore at Milo's ears. Dex was writhing on the ground like a worm and was grabbing at his head as if he meant to rip it off with one final tug. Milo quickly stepped forward and began shaking them both. "Guys, open your eyes," he said, as they began coming back to themselves. Alice looked at him first with a tear in her eyes and then buried her head into her hands. "What the hell was that?" asked Dexter as he began brushing his hands through his hair. "I'm not sure," said Milo, as he looked back down the tunnel with his flashlight held out. "But we need to get above and figure out where we are." They all continued to brush themselves off and then sprinted up the stairs and out of the new building they found themselves in. Outside, the air nearly made their eyes catch fire as the light of the sun shone down through the light rain that had begun falling. The temperature had dropped again, and the rain only served to make them all shiver at the thought of walking in it for very long. Milo stepped out into the road and began circling around, taking mental notes of all the street signs and important-looking businesses, before pulling out his map and scanning over it several times. Meanwhile, Dex had pulled out his rifle and was keeping guard in both directions, while Alice searched through some newspapers on the sidewalk. "They're nearly 3 years old," she said as she held one up. "Why would they still be sitting here as if they were delivered this morning?" asked Dexter as he spun around and stared down his sight. "I don't think anyone's been here in a while. Look around. This place is just as abandoned as everywhere else we've been." Alice's eyes searched over the buildings, and she shook her head. "Where have all the people gone?" The sound of Victor's voice echoed in Milo's head once again, and he had to close his eyes and avert his thoughts to refocus on the map. Finally, he figured it out. "We're in District 47. He paused in frustration. "We're a long way from Elite Industries." The other two took a collective sigh and plopped down in the middle of the road. Alice began twirling her hair while Dexter shined the barrel of his gun. Milo joined them in their rest. He couldn't understand how they had come so far and made so little progress. According to the map, Elite Industries was practically an entire world away. "Damn!" he thought vigorously as he threw some sand away from where he was sitting. Muffled and quiet, a cough made Milo jump and turn to see an elderly man brushing sand off his jacket. Milo jumped and stood up. "Now then," he said, "if I meant you harm, I could have killed you all before you even realized I was here. I mean no harm to anyone." His hair and beard were white, while his skin had been ravaged by time and injury. He had a large scar going from the middle of his forehead down towards the left side of his neck. He wore a gray coat that made him look like mist among the fog. He also wore a gray hat that reminded Milo of the hat that his father used to wear. "Who are you?" asked Milo. "A ghost," said the man as he pulled a golden watch from his pants pocket. He clicked it open and quickly shut it away again. "You're all going to be very late, kids. You should get home before too long." Something about the way the man spoke seemed familiar to Milo, and it bothered him immensely that he couldn't place how so. "Late for what?" he asked the man. "Pandora is waiting for you, but you'll never make it if you try to go that way. The trains must run again. The trains will take you where you need to go. All you need is a ticket, and the ride will be worth the trouble." The man pulled out his pocket watch and checked it before snapping it shut. "The trains haven't run in years. Everyone knows that, old man," spat Milo as he gave the group a questioning glance as if asking permission to shoot. They didn't seem to be paying attention. "The trains will take you where you need to go," said the man again, and he turned and began to walk away. Dex gave Milo a confused look, and Milo pulled the trigger. The bullet flew through the gray man and seemed to keep flying as he casually walked away and faded into the distance. The three of them stood abashed and silenced. Alice was crying again and ruffling her hair as she hung her head in her hands. Milo stared off into the fog and kept reaching out to it several times. trying to catch the evaporating rain in his palms. Dexter asked his friend why he had fired a shot. "This doesn't make any goddamn sense," Milo cried as he raked his eyes. "What is this place?" Nobody answered. There was no certain answer to give. It was Crowhaven, and while Milo had always suspected there was more going on in the city than had met the eye on a day-to-day basis, he was beginning to question much more than dirty politics and foul science developments. He had witnessed things he had thought not possible. "Did anyone else see the fucking ghost just now?" he asked Dexter as he stood up. "Did anyone else see it?" He looked as if he were ready to lose his mind. Dexter grabbed Milo by the shoulders. "What are you talking about?" Alice jumped at this and held her gun to Dexter's head. Dex looked at her and back to his friend. Milo just closed his eyes and stood there waiting for whatever might happen. Dex released Milo's jacket and sat back down, but Alice took a second before becoming calm again. She looked up at Milo and brushed her brown hair out of her face, pulling a band out of her pocket to tie it up with. "The subways do lead straight to Elite Industries," Milo said. "Maybe the ghost has a point." The others looked at him with concern. "How are we going to find a working train and get it moving on the tracks again?" asked Dexter. "I'm not sure, but it might be our quickest and safest course. I'll check the map for the nearest substation, and you guys see if you can find any food lying around this place. We're almost out of rations." They agreed uneasily, but obeyed obediently, as if they hadn't all just threatened to kill one another. Milo pulled out his map and tried to memorize directions. Left, left, right, 2 blocks. Alice returned with a bag of pastries and fruits. Dex returned bearing jerky. "How did you find fruit and pastries if this place has been abandoned?" asked Milo before holding up his hands and stopping her. "You know what? Maybe it's best we don't ask questions right now. I'm starving." Together they ate heartily and happily. They avoided any conversation that would bring tension to their supper and tried to share stories about their toddler years instead. Milo even told a story about him and Dexter getting stuck in a tree when they were 7 years old. "My dad showed up and pulled us down with a ladder he had made from tree logs. He was always crafty that way. Only creativity he had, it was in his work." It was a fond memory for Milo, and it made him smile despite his nervousness and uncertain plans. Dexter also laughed as Milo told it, and it felt good to have things feeling like old times again, even for a short moment. "I never got out much," said Alice, as she took a large bite out of a carrot cake. "But I remember a trip to the market one year. I'd wanted a piece of cherry candy so bad, my parents wouldn't buy it for me. So I stuffed it in my pocket and hid it there until I got home. I never did get caught for it. That's how I learned I'd be better off on my own. I appreciated and loved my parents, but they were never open enough for me to trust them. And that's why I bought this." She held up her gun and put it back in her pocket. She shook her head. "I don't know why I told you guys that. It's a lousy story." Milo assured her that it was fine, and ignored Dexter giving him a look of concern. "At least we've had good food to eat tonight. Some of it should even last until tomorrow." They shared a smile and entered a building for making their beds in. There they slept, and dreamt of times that they could barely remember now. Milo could see himself running down the streets back home, and his parents were on the sidewalk next to the shop, talking to the Alucards. Dexter was chasing behind him, and they were playing tag with water pistols. The parents on the sidewalk waved as they ran by and smiled. But something didn't look right about his parents. A look in their faces that had never been there when he remembered this memory before had crept in and darkened the entire mood of the scene. They looked concerned as they looked out on the relatively empty streets. and the businesses that had closed in the recent months. It was clear that they were growing concerned for what was happening to their town, but Milo had never seen it before. The image seemed to drain of its color, and a gray ghost walked up behind Milo's parents and placed his hand on their shoulders. He shook his head, and a tear fell down his cheek as they all caught fire and turned to ash. Milo screamed out in horror and jerked awake. Back in District 47. Alice and Dexter had been woken up by his scream, but asked no questions as he stood up and instructed them to get ready to move. "We can make the substation in 20 minutes if we don't get sidetracked by anything," he said. "If nothing tries to murder us, you mean," said Dexter. Alice chuckled. "That too," said Milo, forcing a grin that nearly killed his face to perform. They gathered their things and ventured back out into the open. Milo wasn't sure if they stood a chance in the subway tunnels, but he knew of no other way to get to Elite without finding a working vehicle, and that would have been even more foolish to hope for. Please let there be a train. Please let there be a working train. Don't let us get killed. He smiled as the thought passed through his brain, and he stuck a hand through his hair as he shook his head in disarray. What have I gotten us into? He asked himself.